welcome back to the Jake Bequette Show podcast. I'm your host, Jake Bequette, back in the house for another tremendous episode this week. We're going to wrap up our great series on George Washington, another addition to our great men of history, and something that I've really enjoyed speaking about and sharing with you. Obviously, George Washington was first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. As we left off after the first two episodes, we went through George Washington's early life in Virginia, his service in the French and Indian War. In the last episode, we recapped his time as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And as we left off on the last episode, the war had just been completed with the surrender of General Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, and then the subsequent Treaty of Paris that was negotiated between the British Crown and the United States government. And George Washington, brushing aside a small group of Continental Army officers led by Alexander Hamilton, who wanted him to seize power, install himself on the throne, in the mode of many European leaders of the time who had been great military heroes, who then enthroned themselves as a monarch in Washington. For reasons that we explained in the last episode, decided not to do that, and he decided to return home to his estates at Mount Vernon. As we said in the last episode, the British were never physically expelled during the war from New York City after the surrender, or not the surrender, but after they had taken New York Harbor in 1776. The British did not evacuate until 1783. And Washington returned to Mount Vernon after a long absence. In the entire 8 years of war, at the time that he spent as commander-in-chief, he only spent about 10 days total at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was always in his thoughts. It was kind of a way for him to relax. We see from his correspondence that he was, when he was not kind of in his free time, especially during the winter months, he would make plans of Mount Vernon and talk about different crops that he wanted to introduce and different building projects that he wanted to complete. And he kind of used his leisure moments to really just kind of escape and think about his time as a gentleman farmer. And the American Cincinnatus, that's precisely what he did in 1783. He went home to Mount Vernon for 4 years. Most of that time was spent just as you might imagine, focusing on his life as a Virginia planter. He stayed somewhat involved and connected to politics during those 4 years, but really it was a quiet time for him. But it was not a quiet time for the fledgling U.S. government. And I want to touch briefly on the Articles of Confederation and Shays' Rebellion and the events leading up to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. I recommend a great podcast by Orrin McIntyre a few months ago that took kind of a deep dive into the Articles and into Shays' Rebellion. I'm going to pull a few anecdotes from that. But if you want more info on that, I highly recommend listening to that podcast. I believe it was back in June. He had a great guest who talked mostly about Shays' Rebellion and what led to the convention. So really, most people don't understand that the Constitution was not the original form of government for the United States. After the war, the Articles of Confederation were that was the sovereign governing document of the country, and really it really encapsulated, how America really saw itself. It really, until from the American Revolution, I mean, even before the Revolution, up until the Civil War, the country wasn't really a country in the way that we see it today. It was really more of a federation of quasi-sovereign states. As we explained in episode 1, that the states had kind of petty rivalries and kind of bickering between themselves. They put that aside for about 10 years when they had a common enemy in the British. But once the British were defeated, they reverted right back to form and kind of continued their squabbling, except this time they had the complications of trying to rule themselves and trying to deal with issues like the war debt and what was going to happen on the frontier and things of that nature. So the Articles of Confederation really kind of laid out this loose alliance between the states, the former colonies. They had kind of trade relationships, but there was really no understanding of common defense. There was really no understanding about how taxes were going to be collected, and there really was no federal government to speak of. And that's you have to really understand that is what our founders had in mind when the country was originally formed. It was just this very loose, very weak alliance between these sovereign states. And that really ended after Shays' Rebellion. So what was Shays' Rebellion? So after the Revolutionary War, you had obviously a lot of people like Daniel Shays who were Revolutionary War veterans, and they were farmers, people from rural areas. Of course, in that time, most Americans lived on farms. In rural areas, they were not really concentrated in cities, as we see today. And Daniel Shays was one of these guys. He was a farmer from Western Massachusetts, and he came home from the war to discover that he was deeply in debt. His farm was on the brink of having to be sold, liquidated, and he was not alone. Many of the Revolutionary War veterans and people at the time were dealing with the same issues, and that was especially exacerbated by the state governments, particularly Massachusetts, that were levying very heavy taxes on their citizens to pay for the war debts. And I mean, you can imagine just the kind of hilarious and sad irony of someone like Daniel Shays, who fought for liberty, who fought for freedom, who fought against taxation without representation. And then he discovers that in his case, he was being taxed at a rate 5 times higher by the state of Massachusetts than he was under the British. So, I mean, that really stung a lot of these war veterans, and they started to kind of cause a ruckus. And another issue was in the efforts to collect these taxes, the state of Massachusetts, they were dragging people from Western Massachusetts in the more rural areas into courts to settle these tax debts. And these courts were not located in the more rural parts of the state, where people like Shays would get more of a fair judge and jury. These courts were located in the cities, where the people of Boston and the cities, kind of on the coast, were manipulating the process to kind of screw over some of these more rural farmers, and they were very upset about it. So the early stages of Shays' Rebellion in 1786 really kind of mirrored the opening stages of the Revolutionary War in 1775. You had this group of insurgents who were trying to seize arms depots and gunpowder, just like the rebels were doing at Lexington and Concord. And they were kind of shouting the same slogans: no taxation without representation, liberty over tyranny. But the difference was there was a new sovereign government, and that was the state of Massachusetts, and the Articles of Confederation. And it was kind of funny. I mean, just a couple of anecdotes. The state of Massachusetts, the legislature tried to bring up a militia force to suppress Shays' Rebellion. They couldn't appropriate the money because no one wanted to vote for this militia force to suppress their own Revolutionary War veterans. The governor of Massachusetts and the mayor of Boston, they then privately financed a police force or an army to go suppress this rebellion. And at the end of the day, nothing really came of it. Shays' Rebellion kind of sputtered out, and Shays and many of the others were pardoned. Daniel Shays ended up living in Vermont until he retired. It was kind of funny also that the press at the time in the cities, they were claiming that Daniel Shays was under foreign influence. Does that sound familiar? Kind of like people today say that MAGA types are under the pay of Russia and under foreign governments. The state government and the media in Massachusetts was saying that Daniel Shays was an agent of Britain or an agent of France. So time is a flat circle, right? All these talking points come together, and this is why you have to study history, so that when these things happen in modern times, you're not surprised, and you can try to predict how the government is going to react to an insurgency. So really, but the lasting impact of Shays' Rebellion was kind of the shockwave that it sent across the United States, across these different state governments. They realized that they didn't have really any power over the rural areas, and if there was going to be a national government, they were going to have a stronger government, unless they wanted to deal with these kind of mini rebellions taking place over time. It's also Thomas Jefferson, who was a leading anti-federalist, kind of against the formation of a federal government. He was over in France at the time, kind of observing things over there. And this is where he sent his famous letter. Everyone quotes his line. Occasionally the tree of liberty has to be watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants alike. People think that Jefferson was referring to the British and the American Revolution. No, he was actually referring to Shays' Rebellion, which he really sympathized with. Kind of stick that arrow into your quiver when people try to quote Thomas Jefferson, as people in modern media do when they're trying to talk about January 6th or people rising up against a tyrannical federal government. So anyway, that was kind of the backdrop for the call for the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. It was really interesting because Washington, he was nominated as a Virginia delegate, of course, to this new convention. He initially declined because he didn't think the convention was legal. He very vocally questioned the legality of the convention. We'll get to that. But eventually he was persuaded to be there, and in Philadelphia he was immediately and unanimously nominated to preside, to be the president over the convention. Washington, was not a great orator. He was not someone who really, even through his entire political career, he never really contributed a lot in terms of oratory or debate at the First and Second Continental Congresses, as we discussed, and then at the convention. But he was there and he was presiding, and even while he was there, it was a long, bitter summer of 1787 as these delegates were trying to decide what to do. And Washington, he actually spoke to Alexander Hamilton, who was there as a delegate from the state of New York, and he told Hamilton point blank, and this survives in writing, that he regrets any agency in this business, meaning the convention. He didn't think that what was taking place there was going to go over very well. He didn't think what was happening there was legal, because what happened at the convention is that almost immediately, the convention was called to reform the Articles of Confederation. But what quickly happened there, and what the delegates discovered, is that there was kind of a big faction within the convention that wanted to toss out the Articles altogether and create a new, stronger federal government. And that's exactly what happened. There was a series of compromises in the drafting of this new Constitution. It ended up passing, I think, by a margin of like 39-16. There were some notable dissenters like George Mason from Virginia and some others. But really the main compromise they came up with, this is not a podcast about the Constitution. Maybe we can get into that at a later date. But really there was a major compromise over representation. The compromise that was reached, really there were two major compromises that were reached. One, it was between the northern and southern states. As we'll see, there was tension from the very beginning between North and South, between city and rural, and that was the really big disagreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And the compromise that was reached was that there would be proportional representation in the lower house of Congress, and then there would be equal representation in the upper house of Congress, obviously the House and the Senate. And the other major compromise that was reached was that the issue of slavery would not be debated for 20 years. That's actually in the Constitution. They don't use the word slavery, but that was kind of the main fear of the southern states, that they would try to abolish slavery too quickly. And so, in the document, in the Constitution, there is a provision that says that they will not address the international slave trade for 20 years. And they didn't. But that was, that really kind of, as I've explained on previous podcasts, particularly the Andrew Jackson podcast, really this kind of kicked off the Cold War between the North and the South that was to culminate with the American Civil War in 1861. But another kind of interesting anecdote, not all the states were very thrilled about the Constitution. The state of Rhode Island, as a matter of fact, refused to send any delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They did not participate. When the Constitution was presented to them, they decided to put it up for a popular referendum. It was voted down by a margin of 90-10. That's pretty interesting. And then Rhode Island actually did not even ratify the Constitution until 1790, when the new Congress had been sitting for over a year. And Rhode Island finally decided, hey, we're not going to be this independent little country. We'll go ahead and participate in this federal government, or else we might get conquered by it. So again, there were some big-time questions about the legality of the Constitution. A lot of compromises were reached. and Washington had a lot of fears about what this would lead to, and obviously, it led to civil war breaking out in the not so distant future. But anyway, Washington, of course, was nominated and unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. He was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, in New York City, which was the first capital of the United States. And that was really the first, that was the beginning of the United States. And Congress in 1789 created the executive branch departments. Washington's cabinet was kind of a who's who of Revolutionary War and early American leaders. You had Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, who was the leading anti-federalist. You had Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary. You had Edmund Randolph as the first Attorney General. Henry Knox, the Revolutionary War hero, as the first Secretary of War, and then Samuel Osgood as the first Postmaster General. That was the entire cabinet. It was a pretty small government, and really the first term, Washington and the members of the cabinet were just trying to feel things out, try to get the country onto sound economic footing. Most of the issues of the first term were economic in nature, and immediately there kind of emerged a rift between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists within the cabinet. Jefferson and Hamilton, were really going at it back and forth, and they kind of reached a compromise. The compromise that was reached was that Jefferson, who was very much against the federal government, who was very much on the side of the farmers and more rural interests. Jefferson saw the country as, it's kind of the ideal American is kind of this rural yeoman, farmer, planter, kind of like him and a lot of Virginians. And the Federalists under Hamilton, they saw America's future as an economic power, and the best way to do that from his perspective was to create a national bank, take on a lot of foreign debt, and then establish close trading relationships primarily with Great Britain, and establish America and American cities as these economic and mercantile powerhouses. And Hamilton won out, and the compromise that Jefferson was able to extract from Hamilton and the Federalists led by Washington, Hamilton, Madison, and John Adams, the compromise was, okay, we'll establish this national bank, and in exchange, we'll move the capital south from New York City to Philadelphia, which was done almost immediately, with an agreement to establish a new federal capital in the Tidewater area of Northern Virginia, which of course became Washington, D.C. So the capital moved down to Philly, and a national bank was established. And again, there was another element to this first term. There was another minor rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion out in Pennsylvania, kind of similar to Shays' Rebellion. A group of farmers were very upset about excise taxes primarily placed on wheat and grain that were used to create whiskey, hence the name the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington actually, since federal troops were not raised, he actually led the Pennsylvania State Militia in the field, the first and only time that an American president has led troops in combat. There wasn't a lot of combat. It really kind of fizzled out. But Jefferson, he supported the Whiskey Rebellion. And Hamilton, he actually welcomed the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton wanted to use the Whiskey Rebellion as an excuse to raise a strong national army, a federal army, to suppress this revolt and kind of lay down a marker and set the precedent that we were going to crush these internal rebellions once and for all. Washington, once again, was he was the compromising entity. He led these troops, but he was very generous. He gave them all a complete amnesty, and it was actually the first use of the presidential pardon, was pardoning hundreds of people who took part in the Whiskey Rebellion. So, anytime that people talk about insurrectionists, and we have all these political prisoners in D.C. and other places after January 6th. Washington pardoned these people. The American president. It's impossible to imagine someone like Joe Biden pardoning the January 6th people, but that's exactly what Washington did. He pardoned these people who took part in an insurrection against the government, and kind of laid down the marker that hey, we're not going to crush and kill our own citizens. But anyway, the government was established, and the other major point that really took place in the first term was on foreign policy. So there was obviously with the storming of the Bastille in 1789 in France, the French Revolution kicked off. People like Jefferson supported the French Revolution, and the Federalists and people who were more aligned with Britain did not want to see this happen. Washington, again, kind of steered a middle ground. He first concluded peace with Great Britain with the Jay Treaty, which was very controversial in its day. Washington, he really got three concessions out of the British, which were very important in the Jay Treaty, which was ratified by the Senate in a very close vote. But he really got three major benefits. Number one, he got the British to evacuate kind of their western and northern forts on the American frontier. After the Revolution, the British were very, very slow to evacuate these areas, which was kind of causing a lot of tension on the frontier. The Jay Treaty got them to formally agree to evacuate those forts, which they did. Number two, it established a closer trading relationship with Great Britain, which is what Hamilton wanted, and many of the Federalists. And then number three, the Jay Treaty normalized relations with Britain on terms of our federal debt. There were a lot of war debts that were argued back and forth between the states and the federal government and the British Crown, and the Jay Treaty finally settled those. And really, at the end of Washington's first term, he wanted to retire. I mean, again, he was getting old. He was plagued by health problems at this time. He was in his mid to late 60s, which was pretty old by the life expectancy of the day. As many people know, Washington had dental health issues for his entire life. He lost all of his teeth except for one. And he was really plagued by a lot of pain in his mouth and in his head for his entire life. And he really was. He was tired. He felt he had done his duty. But interestingly enough, everyone in his cabinet, including Jefferson, who was becoming an enemy, they all wanted him to stay on for a second term. They really feared that if Washington were to retire, that the whole thing would kind of unravel. They wanted him to stay for another 4 years, and they convinced him to do that. He was elected, once again, unanimously to a second presidential term. Adams came in second again. Back in those days, there was not a president and a running mate. The top two vote getters became president and VP. And there was a sense of continuity with Washington and Adams, being installed for a second term as president and VP. The second term was marked, again, by foreign policy issues. Washington kind of extended an olive branch to the French by recognizing the French National Assembly at that time, the sovereign government of France, the new French Republic, which was a big step because the armies of Europe were at that time arrayed against this new French Republic, in Washington, under Jefferson's urging, decided to formally recognize the French. And Washington, his great friend and confidant from the war, the Marquis de Lafayette, was very important in those negotiations. And so Washington, through a great stroke of genius, was able to then, at that point, he had concluded peace with the two major powers of the time, Britain and France. So, unfortunately, the kind of loose alliance between Jefferson and Washington and the Federalists really dissolved. Jefferson resigned his position in the cabinet almost immediately in the second term, and sadly, he became an enemy of Washington. He began to launch a lot of press attacks, not under his own name, but he was starting to leak a lot of information to the press in America at the time, kind of spreading rumors about Washington not being very intelligent, kind of being under the story went that Washington was easily manipulated by people like Hamilton and Madison and Adams. Of course, some of that was certainly true. As we'll see, Washington really he was not a hands-on type of a executive. He was a master delegator. But it is true that Hamilton, in particular, had a great influence on Washington. Washington really saw Hamilton as a surrogate son. Washington obviously did not have any natural-born sons of his own, and he saw people like Hamilton and Madison, Revolutionary War veterans, as his sons, and that really led to a dissolving of his relationship with Jefferson, as Jefferson and Hamilton became bitter enemies. And Jefferson and Adams were bitter enemies up until their deaths. Just another kind of side anecdote. It's really amazing that Adams and Jefferson, who became the second and third presidents of the U.S., they remained bitter enemies until really their deathbeds, where they reconciled. And quite amazingly, they both died on the same day the 4th of July, I believe, in 1825. So, I mean, the script writers, if you said, if you said this happened, you would think it was made up. Jefferson and John Adams both died on the same day, July 4th, the anniversary of the founding of the country in 1825. But anyway, the second term was kind of marked by this rancor, and Washington really, I mean, at this point, he was tired. He wanted nothing more than to return home to Mount Vernon, now that the country was on more of a sound footing, and that's precisely what he did. He also wanted to set the precedent of resigning the presidency. He didn't want the presidency to be seen as a lifetime appointment. And he also wanted to set the precedent of 2 terms, which every American president up to FDR, the tyrant FDR, in 1940, every other president until FDR kind of abided by this 2-term precedent. And Washington, he decided to return home, and that's exactly what he did. He set the government in order, and I want to touch briefly on his farewell address. I'm not going to go too deep into it on this podcast as we get close to the close here, but I do recommend everyone read his farewell address. It's Washington kind of laying out his accomplishments in his administration, but also his vision for the country. Once again, the farewell address was actually drafted mostly by James Madison, edited heavily by Alexander Hamilton. Washington did make some final edits, but it was mostly drafted by those 2 Federalists. And it's not a surprise that the farewell address really talks about the benefits of Federalist economic policy. But really, more interestingly, in the farewell address, Washington makes a couple of points. Number one, he was very adamant that the United States should not get involved in foreign entanglements. He wanted America to be isolationist, which certainly at that time was the best thing for the country. Some people, neocons over the years, as America has gradually transformed into a global empire, they have disregarded this advice, and we've seen kind of the wages of those mistakes in the Vietnam War, obviously World War II. If you don't think the communists won World War II, you're wrong. They did. In the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and obviously the wars in the Middle East are proof positive that avoiding foreign entanglements is truly in the best interest of America. And then thirdly, Washington, he made a very definitive statement. He said that religion and morality are indispensable supports in a republic. Religion and morality are indispensable supports, those were his words, for a vibrant republic. So, as I've said many times, and I'll say, again, indefinitely, that you can't have a small r Republican form of government without a highly religious people. As John Adams himself said to King George III in 1785 in his audience with the king, he said that he saw Great Britain as our most natural ally because, in his words, we have the same language, we have similar religion, and we have kindred blood. So those are really the foundations of what a republic should be. The same language, the same religion, and kindred blood. I'll leave it to you to decide if that's what we have today. But that is what Washington believed the government should be. And obviously, as we've seen, the modern American empire has completely jettisoned those ideas, and we are reaping the consequences of that. But that was Washington's farewell address, and after that, he returned home to Mount Vernon. He spent a couple of years there. He stayed somewhat involved, through letter writing with President John Adams, who was elected as the second American president. Adams, relations as Adams took over, he was a much more true believer Federalist than Washington. And he, kind of drove the American government into closer relations with Britain. And therefore against France and the French Revolutionary government. That kicked off a time of very bad Franco-American relations. This time was called the Quasi-War. It obviously did not devolve into a hot war, but the French were seizing American merchant vessels on the high seas, and they were very hostile, to the American government and their closer relationships with Britain, as Britain was basically at war with the French Republic for about 20 years, up through the Napoleonic Wars, which ended with Waterloo in 1815, as I discussed on the Napoleon podcast. Washington was actually nominated by President Adams to be the commander-in-chief of a new of a new army that was potentially being raised to fend off a French invasion. It's kind of amazing that at the time the American government was kind of buckling down for an invasion by France. Obviously, that never took place, but the Americans were worried that if the French conquered all of Europe, as Napoleon eventually did, they worried that eventually Napoleon would try to found a new French empire in America, which of course that was the source of the main tension between the American colonists and the French in the French and Indian War, which Washington participated in. So he was very wary of the French or the British trying to reestablish their American empire, which of course the British tried to do in the War of 1812. But that's a subject for another podcast. Washington obviously was never formally called upon to lead this army. The French invasion never took place. But Washington retired to his estates. He received an endless stream of visitors, and that's kind of ironically what led to his death in December of 1799. Washington was out riding his farms, which he did every single day. It was December. It was cold. Have you ever been up to that area of the D.C. area? It's freezing cold and very humid that time of year. There was kind of a cold rain on one day when Washington was out riding, and he came in, and before he changed his clothes, he noticed that he had guests for dinner. And as a good host, he didn't want to be rude, and he immediately, instead of changing out of his wet clothes, he immediately sat down for dinner with these dinner guests. And the next day, he woke up with a very severe cold, which then kind of developed into a form of pneumonia. And unfortunately, tragically, some doctors were called in to save the day. They immediately started to bleed Washington, which was just unfortunately in the barbaric custom of the day was kind of was what doctors like to do. They thought that sickness was caused by bad blood, and the remedy for that was to literally cut people on their arms and legs, apply literal leeches to the body to drain out the bad blood. Of course, this was catastrophic for Washington, and it is kind of bitterly ironic that if the doctors were never called, there's a strong chance he would have survived. But when they brought in those doctors and they started bleeding him, his condition deteriorated rapidly, and he eventually died on December 14th, 1799. In his will, he took the very propitious step of freeing all of his slaves, all the slaves that he owned personally, and he actually kind of made what could be seen at the time as an illegal move of freeing all the dower slaves that he was incumbent to manage as part of Martha Washington's estate from her first husband, Custis. But he decided to free his slaves and set that precedent. And that was a big step for a Virginia planter. That was a primary source of his property at the time, were I think about 100 slaves that he owned. But he wanted to set the marker that slavery had to end, that it was not sustainable in the American government. But tragically, we all know how that ended. It didn't end. And was not to end until the American Civil War. But Washington, he had the foresight to free his slaves on his deathbed. Tragically, Martha Washington decided to burn most of their correspondence. It's been a burr in the saddle of historians since that time, that all that correspondence was destroyed. No one knows why. Martha never really explained why she did that. It's not clear if there was some embarrassing material in there to Washington, or if she didn't want their love letters to see the light of day. But whatever it was, she decided to burn his correspondence, and so we'll never know truly the extent of all of Washington's most intimate thoughts. And it might be better that we don't know. We will obviously love to know, but that really it came to kind of enhance the myth of Washington himself. And of course, as I mentioned in the first episode in the opening part of this podcast as well, Light Horse Harry Lee's funeral oration to Washington called him first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. George Washington, his legacy. He was the indispensable man to not just the American Revolution, but the United States of America. Without Washington, the Revolutionary War never would have been successful. The country never would have been founded. Who knows what would have happened in the future between the American colonies and the British Empire if the Revolutionary War failed. it's possible that eventually there would have been a successful revolution, or the British would have disgorged the American colonies as they disgorged a lot of their empire around World War I and World War II. We'll never know. But what we do know is that if it weren't for George Washington, the United States of America never would have come into being from 1776 until his death in 1799. And it's quite amazing that even though the quasi-war was still being fought between France and America at the time, First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte, by then essentially the dictator of the French government, he wrote an ode to who he called the American Cincinnatus, George Washington. So even in the midst of these hostilities, people like Napoleon had an amazing amount of respect and awe and admiration for George Washington, what he meant to not just the American government, but the precedent he set for governments worldwide. It is certainly true today that, for better or for worse, the democratic form of government that we have, that's been exported around the world, those things never would have happened if it weren't for George Washington, who was a great statesman, a great farmer, a great businessman, a great general, warrior, the first president, the indispensable man of the United States, and one of my personal heroes of history, a true great man of history, George Washington. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast series. Like this podcast, share it around, give us a 5-star review. This thing has really taken off. It's been so much fun for me to do these episodes, and there will be more in the future. But until next time, I'm Jake Bequette. This is the Jake Bequette Show, and we'll see you again soon.